and welcome to episode 86 of the Let's Talk Thyroid podcast, where we're diving into the topic surrounding food sensitivities. But it's a much broader conversation around gut health, immune health, cell memory, cell danger response, whether to have food sensitivity tests, what's the gold standard. And I'm covering all of this with my special guest today, Christa Bielger, who is an author, a podcast host. You're going to want to check out her podcast. It's called The Less Stressed Life. And she has a private practice helping health-savvy women overcoming food sensitivities and fatigue without restrictive dieting to beat bloat, burnout, and eczema breakouts. She's got a passion for subclinical thyroid issues, the nervous system, and stealth biotoxins. She lives with her unicycling husband and kids in the Midwest of the USA. I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. It's quite liberating. And you're going to want to stick around for the KISS Thyroid coaching segment at the end of the show, just like we've been doing this year, to help you to pull out one or two things that you can actually action as a result of this conversation. Well, welcome, Christa Bielger, to the Let's Talk Thyroid podcast. We're going to dive right into food sensitivities today. So I'm really glad that you're here to share your wisdom and experience with us.
Perfect. Well, this is kind of where my practice started, was in food sensitivities, and it's come full circle in an interesting way. So I'm happy to share absolutely anything you want to know about food sensitivities, and hopefully we'll do the listener a good service today.
Yeah, excellent. Because I don't always ask my thyroid community if they've got questions, depending on what the topic is. But when I asked a couple of days ago, right, I'm interviewing someone next week about food sensitivities, I just got like a barrage of questions. I'm like, right, okay, you've got lots of questions. So I think that is great because, I've got questions too. And some of you ask questions that I wouldn't have thought to ask. So I think that is good. So Christa, you said this is where you started and you've come full circle. Do you want to give us a quick overview of what your practice is about? What you're doing in the health space?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm an integrative dietitian nutritionist. I've been practicing since 2010. I started going into private practice about 2016. Long story short, I was intrigued in we're all interested in health, right? And so my curiosity, we're all like our first patient almost. But long story short, I had bought a training for dietitians around food sensitivities, which was very niched and nuanced. And I set it on the shelf. And then my mentor came around and said, hey, there's someone where you live looking for help with this. And so it gave me kind of a push to start doing this. And so what happened was it was an incredible tool. Like, people were getting 25, 50, 75% better in a couple of weeks by changing their diet, which was awesome. But it wasn't like, if we unwrap the integrative process and appropriately how you do things and why people have food sensitivities in the first place, you realize it's great until it's not anymore. And we've come from an entire decade of elimination diets. What I was doing, so I know a lot of nuanced information about food sensitivities, but for me now, I like overcoming food sensitivities more than restriction, because we've just come from a decade of minimum of this over restricting in the functional medicine space. And so food changes are more impactful for certain populations than others and certain symptom profiles. So food sensitivities are not, in my opinion, a true root cause anymore. I mean, I think they can have a big piece of it, but there's quite a bit to unwrap there. So basically it was amazing until it wasn't. Then I had to start learning other modalities or figuring out how is the immune system getting information, and it's being informed by multiple other things as well. So if you're not addressing those other things, then you continue to have sensitivities or malleable, changing, moving target food sensitivity. So that can become really frustrating to people as well. So that's kind of where it started. In eliminate, we were having these great opportunities, then we had to improve upon it. And now it's a bit different. Now I'm actually discouraging people from elimination if they don't need it, which is often a breath of fresh air for some people. I think it's good there's different ways to look at how to approach diet. And I'll just mention this briefly, but you can kind of go about it from a place of curious optimism. I'm going to do a targeted experiment for a few weeks. What can happen is sometimes people go into something and maybe they feel better short term, but there's no exit strategy. And so at first it starts okay. And then it becomes kind of sucky and prolonged and really restrictive and exhausting. And then we kind of end up in like in a non-nourished state. And when we're in a non-nourished state, our brain and our adrenals are like, there's a problem here and I have some issues. And then, in the context of like thyroid conditions, it could actually be worse. So, there's always like two sides to every coin. Can this be used? Like how you go about this depends on the profile. And if you've already been restricting a lot, I definitely discourage people to do a ton of like over restriction, right? Where we're restricting many, many food groups and different things like that. So I kind of, when I say full circle, I'm like, well, I started in the restriction space and now I'm kind of like, let's not restrict if not needed, but I'm pretty balanced and not dogmatic. So I'm open to both angles if needed, but I try to make it very sustainable because I'm just an average human being that likes to enjoy food and life. And I find most of my people like to also enjoy food and life. It's not very low stress, right? If we're like having to dissect every piece of everything everywhere we go, right? So if we can try to not be in that place, we're better off. And there's just so many things that tell our immune system to react to things, and it can be pretty confusing. I know you have like a really interesting question that feels tricky, and I have some thought about the itchy ears. So anyway, so we'll talk about how things can kind of masquerade. Things masquerade as food sensitivities, but really the root causes usually can be something else. So.
It does. It just adds that whole depth. Like it's just, I don't know, whenever
it's not just food.
It's never just food. So I often say it's never just one thing. And I mean, my personal experience, food's made a massive difference, but it's not the whole picture. It's absolutely not the whole picture.
You have to have a good foundation.
Yeah, totally. And it's so individual. We're all so unique. And when we overlay thyroid and autoimmune thyroid, it's just so, there's just depths of complexity. So,
for sure.
I think one of the things that, I like to do on the show is, be positive and practical, but, and give people some takeaway tools that they can actually implement, but at the same time, really help people to understand this is a complex disease and there's elements of things that you can do on your own, but you also need the support of professionals as well.
I think this is why food is very popular, because there's a zillion books about it, because it's a DIY strategy that is certainly usable, very tangible, right? And honestly, changing your diet for the very first time has challenges, because the first time we do anything for the first time, it's hard. The first time you go skiing, the first time you go riding a bike, the first time you roller skate, it's all difficult. And so changing your diet is not different than that. So the first time you do anything is a little bit harder. And so going through just the experience of that teaches you a lot sometimes, right? That has maybe nothing to do with food, or maybe it does. We have a lot of things, attachments around food that have nothing to do with food, right? Of course, like all kinds of relationship things, how your mother's relationship with her body was, that all affects like your current relationship with food, which is just like a bit of a tangent, but, it's all informing your brain, which is informing your immune system. So anyway, I think it's popular because there's a lot of books, there's a lot of DIY stuff. You can have like really quick transformations when you change your diet. But it's maybe not the end all be all. It just sort of depends on how restrictive it gets. And so what I see is where it has gone too far or where people are exhausted with it, right? So I'm looking through that lens pretty commonly. If people change their diet and they're like, I am just 75% better and I keep this good diet and I'm happy with that, there's a good chance I don't see those people, right? Because they're content. Why would they seek out someone who does stuff that I do, right? So I'm looking through the lens of, what I see as an issue and then trying to resolve those problems that I see with where we are kind of currently in society.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, when we're talking about thyroid health, and I mean, I know that's broad in and of itself. And so I would say, statistically, Hashimoto's is the most common, that would be the most common, aspect of thyroid health that my audience would have, but certainly not exclusively. I know that because, I talk to a lot of people with other conditions, but can you explain, is there, or what is the connection between food sensitivities and thyroid health?
Yeah. I think I would separate thyroid health, kind of like you did, into thyroid issues and autoimmune thyroid issues, right?
Yeah, okay.
So if we got hypo and hyperthyroid, that is certainly immune system that's certainly dysfunction of the thyroid gland or cell danger. Like, actually, we have several theories about what's going on, right?
Yeah.
But once you have autoimmune thyroiditis, usually Hashimoto's, but sometimes Graves' disease, there is this autoimmune component, which means that other stuff is involved. So gut health is involved, toxic burden is involved. And who says that isn't involved with hypo and hyperthyroid? And before it's even diagnosed, I mean, I have like a big spot in my heart for before we even are diagnosed. It's like we have these symptoms and they have to get pretty atrocious sometimes for it to show up on blood work. It sort of depends. It's a bit of a snapshot in time. I would say food sensitivities can be more implicated in any autoimmune condition. And autoimmune conditions usually don't hang out by themselves. They usually like start to gather friends. So you get one, and then because the root causes are really similar, it starts to manifest in other types of symptoms. And before you know it, you accumulate multiple autoimmune conditions. If you haven't yet, it's just a common thing, right? It's like you have one, and because there's dysfunction or dysregulation in the immune system, it's like it just starts presenting in different ways, which gets a new label essentially. So short answer is, and I don't know if we want to go back and talk about like what the difference is between sensitivities, allergies, et cetera, because I think that can be kind of confusing, and also it's because we don't universally agree about it in the world. But if it's always good to have like a good whole food diet, and food sensitivities become more of an issue anytime there's autoimmune conditions. So therefore, Hashimoto's or Graves' versions of thyroid issues have potentially more food-based implications. However, like you said, it's just a possible piece of the treatment pie. Actually, most Hashimoto's clients that walk into my office, I don't like over restrict. Again, I don't, because there's a lot of gut health players involved as well, which technically what's going on in the gut changes how you tolerate foods. The end. Like that's just the very basics of it. Like your most food sensitivities are caused by some kind of gut dysfunction, and that can include mold stuff and then stress chemistry and what's happening in the nervous system, because those two things influence the immune system the most. And if the immune system has dysregulation, you'll have innate immune system, like literally the innate immune system will be out of balance, and you'll have Th1, Th2 out of balance, and you'll either present, there's a couple like very different ways you can present, but a lot of times I see people that are presenting with like sinus stuff or kind of allergy-ish type style or UTI stuff, et cetera. And that's kind of like Th2 dominant overall. So that's what happens. You have this stuff telling the immune system, hey, I'm kind of like under fire. What you going to do about it? And the immune system's like, well, I'm trying to manage. And it's trying to kind of dance around this stuff. So,
So that's looking at the root cause of the root cause in
exactly.
Digging deeper. Yeah.
Right.
So if you've got those sort of gut imbalances and as you say, stress or mold or, other gut things, is that just like another layer on top, or can that make it worse? Like if you're then eating foods that aren't helpful, do you know what I'm asking?
Yep. That is a good question. Well, let me insert this question. Someone asked you, are itchy ears related to a food sensitivity? So itchy ears are a fungal symptom, and so is throat clearing, and so is, there's like a zillion, but so are recurrent vaginal infections. You don't have to have all of these. I'm just kind of saying like there's several, right? White coated tongue, itchy scalp or like flaky scalp, vaginal or yeast or bacterial vaginosis, like recurrently, athlete's foot or toenail fungus. But anyway, sinus stuff, throat clearing, itchy ears, those are all significant fungal symptoms. So guess what is a big, ugly fungus is mold, which is just a problem of our times, right? And I'm not like making it into a bigger issue than it is. It tends to be an issue for people, and it presents itself as you start to heal, because there's some things that just kind of come back, or what it is it's a more aggressive fungus. So it takes a more aggressive approach treatment plan. And it really, it really insults our detoxification as well. So if you have a fungal colony living inside of you that maybe you picked up in your childhood home, and it's just like kind of low grade and you kind of live your life and whatever, you have some little bit of fungal overgrowth, you can have these symptoms present and they can look worse with certain foods. The problem with people having a little bit of a mold colony inside of them is that they look like they're reacting to so many foods, including sugars, which is like a ton of stuff, right? Like certain carbohydrates, grains, because grains are very commonly moldy. It could be coffee. It could be chocolate. Coffee is a very moldy product as well. So it can kind of look like this very unusual mixture of things. Another sneaky symptom here is if you get tongue sores or canker sores on your tongue, often by citric acid, some citric acid, and it'll be like, wow, I'm not reacting to this citric acid product, but I am from this one. Some citric acid is grown on mold. A lot of things used in the food industry or used in medications are grown on mold, or like penicillin is a mold, et cetera. So it just depends on the colony inside of you and if you're reacting. So the tricky thing with mold is like, is it really a food sensitivity, or are you actually just feeding the aggressive fungus inside of you that needs to be eliminated and moved out, And so first it's like awareness is really the first step, right? And then you can do the work around it. So that's the tricky part, because it looks like it's a food problem. And this is, I theorize, I think there's multiple reasons different things and diets work for people. And I think it's good to talk about it. So I think there's a type of diet, right, that is very popular and people have had a lot of success with it, called autoimmune paleo. And some of the early proponents of those, the big people in that community, have really stepped back and said, like, this is not all, right? Like, we must do more here. So I want to mention that even the people whose books and blogs and things people read, they're even kind of like recalibrating how they're talking about it. But if you are dealing, like one of my questions, I have a social media post about this, is like, is it a food sensitivity or is it really mold, right? Because it's going to look like you're responding to a lot of things. But anyway, an autoimmune paleo, you restrict so many things, including grains, coffee, and all these things, and you can feel dramatically better. And so the question is, are you feeling dramatically better because you're reducing your toxic burden? You're eating foods that are easy for you, like you're nourishing a whole bunch, right? Like that's all positive, right? That's very possible. And is it also better because maybe you have, like, again, it's individual to each person, but do you have potentially a bit of a fungal colony? Mold testing is kind of like tricky. It's a little bit hit or miss. I just find that when you're working through protocols, the people who have some mold colony, it just takes a little bit stronger protocols and it takes a little more time. That's the nice way to say it. You feel crappy. And it really presents itself sometimes.
And it's going to require a bit of a hard-hitting approach to resolve it. Yeah.
It's like it's definitely more work. So it kind of sucks, but
Yeah. But if you can get to that, I guess the upside is if you can really identify that it really is a mold issue, and you take the time set aside to deal with that.
And then you can enjoy your life.
Then you're getting on with it. Then you're dealing with it, not just.
It's annoying because it has no limits, right? It could affect your vision. It affects your adrenals, so that it can make you have all kinds of weird symptoms. So it doesn't really know any limits, unfortunately, which is and I work with like a lot of skin stuff too. And so the skin is simply an elimination system. And so if you're struggling with your elimination systems, which this kind of thing will like jam it up, especially when you start to work on it, it'll make it can kind of jam it up. So you can have some like rash you never had before as a possibility. So it's a good time. It's a good time. It's nice if someone can kind of look, subclinical thyroid symptoms and like sneaky fungus symptoms are kind of both areas where I feel like I spend a lot of time. So anyway, so I'm probably looking through those glasses, right? A little bit. But that's okay, because I don't want people restricting perfectly good foods for the rest of their lives either. Right. So anyway.
Yeah. So that's really helpful. So that's understanding the, well, we've answered the itchy ear question, so go look at mold. If that was the that asked, and there are a couple of people that asked that actually. So that was a good, and a really helpful explanation.
Right. Yeah. There's a ton of mold in food, and but I focus more on. So I think your actual question was like, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was something about restricting. Like if I eat certain things, I was thinking about how, when you have gut dysbiosis or mold or other things, you aren't digesting foods properly. So you'll see people will restrict and eliminate carbohydrates and they'll feel better temporarily. Well, that was just one of the preferred food sources for these gut bugs. Sorry, I've never had to sneeze on a podcast, but there we go.
Right.
So, anyway, so because this dysbiosis, what it does is it interferes with enzyme production. If you interfere with how you digest things, those undigested things feed the bad bugs. It's like weeds in the lawn. The weeds steal the food that the grass should have, and then they paralyze the grass, the good bacteria, and the good bacteria are part of how good enzymes work to break down things. And so anyway, when we restrict carbohydrates in the short term, we're like, oh, I'm better. Long term, it could be an issue for us thyroid wise, because our thyroid does like carbohydrates, different profiles of people, me for sure. So anyway, so instead of restricting something, I actually want to be able to digest it and utilize it, would be the preferred version. So anyway, so it's tricky because our brain, like we like to see evidence and proof, right? And so when we are eating, we can kind of see immediate evidence and proof of things, right? And so it can be kind of tricky when you're getting the message that, oh, when I eat these, I feel really bloated. That's okay. So we take that, we log it, and then we kind of look at the rest of things in context and say, well, actually, what's the real problem? Is there actually gut imbalances? And sometimes it's just couldn't be clearer, right? People are burping. People are having indigestion. They're having some gut. It's always easy if they're having other gut symptoms. If they're not having other gut symptoms, sometimes some gut symptoms can become brain symptoms, right? They can be like mood changes and anxiety and other things like that. Brain fog. Oh, we all know about brain fog here, right? If we're talking the thyroid community.
Community. Yep.
Like a telltale sign of gut dysbiosis is, oh, I become more brain fogged after I eat. Oh, well, you're probably not digesting that. And so you're feeding the weeds, and the weeds give off seeds, and those seeds are like endotoxins of the bacteria, and they cross the blood-brain barrier, and now you have brain fog post-meal. So it's kind of like a dead ringer for me that the gut is not working optimally when people are like, oh, I'd rather just not eat because I'm more fogged after I eat. Well, you're clearly you're not processing that through in the machine of the digestive system very well.
Yeah. So I think is what you're saying then, that's not a food sensitivity issue. That's a gut health issue.
Yeah, that's really the question. Are you really dealing with food sensitivities, or what if you actually are digesting poorly? The problem is that we have preconceived notions on what digesting well should look like. So we don't realize that if bowel movements come out on the other end, they look okay, and we don't see undigested food, that we still might not be digesting well. Here are some other giant signs that you're not digesting well. You eat a large amount of protein and it kind of sits like a rock, or just doesn't feel awesome, or you feel kind of just like heavy. That's like a big one, really obvious one. You have low B12. So that's not normally tested. You can ask that to be tested. And unfortunately, the reference range has really diminished since I've been in practice, because we base our reference ranges on labs on the previous subset of symptoms. And so our population is not ideal or optimal. And so we're basing it on a suboptimal population, because those are the people going to the doctor typically to have labs drawn, because they're looking for things. And so the reference range used to be like 350 or 400 to 1200. Now it's like 2 something to 1000 or 900. So it's really gone down. For me, if it's under 500, I think you could support B12. So anyway, why is that a digestive symptom? Because if you don't digest animal proteins well, that's the only source of getting B12 and uptaking that into the system. So if you're not digesting an animal protein, you're not going to get B12. So you're going to have low B12, which is really important for your energy, because if you have low B12, you probably feel like you have no energy as well. So those are some really big dead ringers. Gas and bloating are obvious signs of poor digestion, right? Because undigested things are going to ferment and cause gas and bloating, etc. What else do we want to say? Burping is one. And then also, if you're like, here's a really, really big one. If you're nauseous at all, that can be some bacterial imbalances, but it can also be like, sometimes I actually had someone, she was on such a healthy diet. She's like, okay, so I had some pizza or something, and then she was nauseous. Well, she ate a slightly higher fat food. her liver was not keeping up with bile production, which digests the fat, and that'll cause nausea. And long-term birth control can make gallbladder sluggish. There's all kinds of meds and things that can cause sluggish gallbladder and liver function. It's because the gallbladder stores that bile, but like our body has to deal with all this toxic burden of anything we put on our skin or in our body. And so there's a lot of things that can tax the system and then result in kind of a sludgy system. So it's all about optimizing systems to work well. But how often are food sensitivities really problems with digestion? Most of the time.
Okay.
The majority of the time. That is actually the problem. That is my belief. And that's kind of the premise of my work now. It's like, oh, you actually can do fine with this if you could digest it better. It's just that this may not fit what you think digestion should look like. You're not seeing grapes in your stool or whatever, right? And so you don't think that that's the issue, but it is. You know, if you're having things come out in some other way on the skin, you're having gas or bloating, you're having some kind of symptom, there's probably another piece in the middle of it.
So then do you think food sensitivities are still a thing? Like, do we go back to there? Like, you know, and do people bother to test for food sensitivities? Like,
I don't much anymore because I'm looking to I am looking to be a good steward of my clients' finances and be efficient. So efficiency is one of my core values. So most efficiently, I'm not going to do any food sensitivity testing. I might, if there's an autoimmune profile and it makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't make sense because stress is too high. And so that's really the priority would be to support the adrenals, which, by the way, the thyroid cannot work properly without the adrenals feeling safe. So so that's like really important to pick that up from somebody, right? Like figure out, is this going to serve someone or actually send them further into a hole? And I see that all the time. Like another possible co-diagnoses you might see is PCOS. You know, there's all these types of PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian. I'll try not to digress too much, but there's a type of PCOS that is adrenal dominant PCOS, and it doesn't really look like the rest. It basically looks like no period, and it's adrenal problems. And so what the providers will say is like, limit your carbohydrates and increase your exercise or increase your cardio, which is basically the opposite you would do if you were trying to support someone's adrenals. So then it looks worse. So very tricky, right? When that kind of thing happens. So how did I get off on that tangent? I'm not sure. Where was I? I am looking at, it's very funny. I am watching my children fight out the window right now. Because we are after school, like it's morning at your house and it's evening at my house. And I'm like, are you going to hit her with that shovel? What's happening out there? So I'm just being real right now.
If there's a medical emergency.
No, you're good. I'm just like, what are you guys doing out there? You guys are old enough to be fine, but it's just kind of funny. Like it's a challenge when your office looks into the backyard, which feels sometimes I've seen some very interesting things back here, Annabelle. Anyway. Okay. Where were we?
I agree. Yeah,
we were
I've seen
talking
a child break another child's arm in my backyard.
Really?
Oh no! A number of years ago, not deliberately, but they were. And this is years ago. They were. So again, my office overlooks my backyard as well. Yeah. And my kids are all at school today, so different time of the day. And they were just play wrestling. It wasn't a fight. Yeah. I mean, I've got 3 boys. They definitely fight. This wasn't fighting. They were just kind of wrestling.
Oh yeah.
And then all
as
of a
boys
sudden,
do.
I just saw. Yeah, the older one just his knee went onto the other one's arm, and I didn't actually. I sort of half saw it, and then I heard the scream, and anyway, that's a big digression. So I understand that looking out the window at his.
You're like, what is happening? One day a skunk walked by, and then my cat followed it into the chicken coop, and I was like, I'm going to take a pause after. No, I'm just joking. Like it is so funny, the things you see in the back window. And I will say, I've been podcasting a long time and people always like to hear these human stories, real human life. Like, are my kids hurting each other in the backyard? And if they look like they're making something you probably could not resonate. I'm not sure. I know in Australia, there's different stuff in different places, but I've got about 5 feet of snow in my backyard with more on the way tomorrow. And, so anyway, they're building an igloo. And so that's why
that's very cool.
Involved.
That will definitely not happen in my house. We live in tropical Queensland. A long way from any snow or igloos. So, all right. So, back to
food sensitivities. Where were we on that topic? We were talking about adrenals for some reason. Yeah. I think you were asking, should we even do food sensitivity testing, right?
Yeah.
And I was saying,
I guess, and you said not really. You don't.
Well,
really
if the adrenals
much.
are under stress, right? So if people are already coming from a stress place, they've already done restriction, is that really serving them best, right? Mm-hmm. If they haven't changed their diet at all yet, because there's a lot of stuff you can do DIY. If they've never changed their diet, I might not start with testing. It depends on the person, but it's quite a bit more expensive to do testing and the protocols that follow than to do something or have a whole food diet on your own, which you could manipulate for free. So those are my opinions. But can it be super duper useful in certain populations? Yes. Autoimmune populations, certain cases of blood sugar dysfunction, it kind of depends. Sometimes if there's like a lot of inflammatory water weight, sometimes if the person needs a reason or they need something to attach their kind of intentional reset to. And this is a tricky topic, like the intentional reset of, hey, I want to do this really specific food-based protocol for a few weeks. Again, you can do generic versions. I think food sensitivity testing or high quality food sensitivity testing can be good if you've done one of these generic protocols and you saw benefits, but there were still some other things that were unresolved depending on the symptom. If I was digging in itchy ears, I wouldn't do it, right? Because I'm like, let me look for other signs and symptoms. But depending on the symptoms, then at that point, it might make sense to do. Otherwise, I skip over it and do gut stuff and nervous system regulation stuff, because both of those are really telling the immune system whether the brain is safe, which is really in control of everything and thereby predicts, the food sensitivities, we kind of think of it as a root cause, but it's not. There's more root causes, but you said this before, like there's the root cause to the root cause. And I do think if it's okay with you, since I know our topic is food sensitivities, I think it does make sense or it does behoove us to talk about the difference between sensitivities, intolerances, and allergies as well, because
of course. That
gets a little bit misconstrued. So whenever you're ready, or I can jump right in there.
Yeah, go for it. Let's do that. Yeah.
So one thing that's a little bit tricky is that we just misinterpret this. So I want to lay this out. And one analogy I use is kind of like, let's say you've got all these Nerf guns, right? Nerf guns and Nerf bullets, and there's different colored Nerf bullets. And those are immune system mediators. There's IgG, IgM, T cells, IgA, etc. And they're all different colored Nerf gun bullets. So there is one type of immune system mediator that we think is consistent over time, and we universally agree about it, more or less. And we have more or less universal systems for testing. And that is allergy or IgE or immunoglobulin E testing. I say more or less because there are nuances. So some providers will not test below 3 years of age or 5 years of age. Some will. And sometimes I think it is merited, but your immune system is still developing till you're at least 3 years old, and then it's kind of set. So we definitely would expect to see some shifts. So if I'm working with a child, I would hope that we can kind of shift what's going on in the immune system by affecting what's going on in the gut to potentially optimize and help them grow out of different allergies. There's all kinds of research on like growing out of milk allergies, growing out of egg allergies, et cetera, et cetera. What can we do to optimize that, right? So that's why I'm like, well, there's still a gray area. Then when I have looked in the literature for this, and it's been a few years, so I'm not under any impression that this would have changed yet, but the gold standard or the preferred testing for environmental allergies should be skin testing. The preferred modality for food allergies should be blood testing. And if you can do both, like overlapping them, that is really the gold standard.
Okay.
My understanding is that these are not like super perfectly accurate anyway. And here are some examples of where I've seen this be an issue for people. Some people have gone in, they feel like they're reacting to a lot of stuff, so they get some allergy testing and they light up to everything. That's what they say. They say, like, I lit up like a Christmas tree. I reacted to everything. Well, one type of testing can affect that, obviously. Two, that's immune system haywire, right? So like, do you really have an allergy, or is your immune system on fire? Because like, really, should you be allergic to absolutely everything? No, that's absurd, right? Like, so, and there's a whole corner of the world for this, right? And there's a reason that these mast cells are like freaking out. There's usually some kind of like not very good, like there's really negative impact. There's really negative communication to the immune system from something like mold, like something going on in the nervous system, like something that happened that kind of triggered this typically. So that's an allergy. So I like to say like we have a universal system, but you can see there's still a bit of nuance, right? With sensitivities and intolerances, actually we interchange this word a ton. I would say there is, I don't know where it is in my office right now, but there is a book, I think it's like by Brockhoff or something like that. There's like a few authors, and it's kind of I think the gold standard for like looking at food sensitivities, allergy sensitivities, probably for practitioners. But anyway, there's a bit of a gray blur between intolerance and sensitivities. I view it like this definition. This is one version. Intolerances are kind of like lactose intolerance, where your body doesn't really have the enzyme to break down a certain thing. We've kind of talked about that a little bit already, but that one's a really recognized one, right? It's like, oh, well, lactose intolerance is really common. There's other intolerances, sucrase intolerance. That's kind of a more interesting one, and that I don't really encounter that much, but there's a drug for it. So I've been contacted by the drug rep around it, right? So those are intolerances like, hey, I struggle with that enzyme. And then there's sensitivities, and sensitivities are going back to the Nerf bullets. So like, let's say the IgE Nerf bullets, that mediator was a red Nerf bullet. But what about the yellow, the green, the purple? Like, what about these other IgM and IgA and T cells and all these other immune, because there's all kinds of messengers going off all the time, like walking or like guards, checking things, etc. What can happen with food sensitivities very literally and just very plainly is we can have our gut lining can be experiencing more permeability, right? So like fishnet tights instead of nylons. And so you can have larger than normal food proteins going through the layers. And then the guards are like, that does not look like the vitamin C that was supposed to check in here, but it's really like a part of an orange or something, right? And so what the body can do is say like, you look like an invader, pow, 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 and it shoots different Nerf bullets at it, IgM, IgA, T cells, etc. Right? But what happens if you heal that gut lining, you digest that food better, right? You break it all the way down, it goes where it's supposed to go. Everything is in harmony, right? Like as it should be. Then the guards aren't like shooting things off. So this is why you can be reactive to perfectly healthy foods. Or I had a client ask me, I've been taking turmeric for this knee thing for like 10 years. And so I'm like, well, you can develop a sensitivity to a perfectly anti-inflammatory or like healthy thing because it's crossing this permeable membrane. And you can do this from putting it on your skin too. There's like broken skin and stuff if you're doing it really consistently. So when people do food sensitivity tests, sometimes they'll see themselves reacting to foods they eat every single day. You see that all the time. Those are the things that are talking to the immune system, that are entering, that are crossing that barrier, and the guards are like shooting all those Nerf bullets at it, right? And so what you'll see is as your diet shifts, as the lining of the gut shifts, as the immune system status shifts, you can have varying reactions to different things. And so what's the real goal is to get things as optimal as possible. Heal the gut lining, improve the immune system and how you digest things so you don't have things leaking across the thing, or undigested proteins, which cause immune system inflammation. And then you aren't reacting to all these goofy, crazy things, because that's what we see all the time. It's like you're reacting to things you eat all the time. And so it is malleable. It is a moving target, literally, right? Moving target, literally, because it's depending on what's going on in you at that moment and what you're consuming a lot. Are there exceptions to this? Sure. I've seen all kinds of exceptions, but I would say that is like much more common. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah. So would it be fair to say, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that, say you've got leaky gut, you try to have a period of time where you're healing the gut, should you take some foods out for a period of time and then, as you say, those sensitivities change over time because your gut is changing, and if it's healed, then you can probably,
that's our goal,
tolerate.
Right? That's our goal. Yeah. And I will say, I want to mention that gut permeability could be argued as not a root cause as well. The root cause of gut permeability could be pathogens and imbalances and stressors, because those will blow holes in the gut lining, right? And so I have to mention that. So some people go out and take like glutamine or like all these things that will heal gut lining, but they're not really addressing what caused the issues in the gut lining in the first place. So then they aren't successful. So I want to mention that because I see that a lot. It's kind of doing things out of order, so to speak. So what your question is sitting, I call this sitting down with a sprained ankle. If you are walking around with a sprained ankle while you're trying to heal it, is it healing very fast? No, it is not. It's adding insult to injury. So that'll happen with foods. And so this is why if you can sometimes relax the diet or remove some things or make it easier for your body to digest or nourish while at the same time giving it a break so it can do more healing instead of more work and trying to like, and more having more guards going on. You know, it's like trying to rebuild while you're still in a war zone, right? How do you calm things temporarily? So this is where, you know, diet adjustment could be really helpful if you were efficiently working on healing. If you're just going to limit it without any plan to do anything else, I have concerns around it because I've seen it fail, right? So have people done things like that and shifted gut bacteria? Yeah, they have, but you're not going to like restrict your diet and kill a parasite, in my opinion, right? Which could be causing immune system dysfunction, right? Which are just so much more common than we would think. And they're not they're not great on testing. And you had asked, I think, a question about, well, I was talking about testing for different things, right? We have universal testing for IgE or allergy testing, sensitivities. There's all kinds of different tests and not really a gold standard. So some tests are just looking at IgE nerve bullets, and then some tests are looking at all the nerve bullets. And so it gets a little bit tricky. And then some people look at those test results and just restrict those things, right? And then there's different ways you can go about things. There's always more than one way to do things, right? And so for me, I don't think that that's the most useful way to get most ROI or leverage out of that protocol. So I do it a little bit differently. I could share if you want to, but anyway, so testing, if we don't have a universal process, then we tend to not be very accepting of it, right? Conventionally, we actually do recognize food sensitivities because, this isn't like a sneaky one, because we recognize non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So we clearly recognize sensitivities, but we're like, no, we don't recognize food sensitivities. So the problem is that we don't actually agree on what's going on in the gut. Like there's all kinds of microbiome testing, but because there's not also gold standard testing and clear like protocols around that, and it's not like cut and dry, black and white, like we aren't agreeing about that across disciplines, across professions, across the world. It's confusing for the consumer, right? And that's it's okay. I don't want the government to control everything. I don't think they do a really great job at it. Like it's not their forte. So that's the only way you get things to be super, like, you know, it's really hard to get glaciers to all be on the same page, right? Like really slow moving bodies. So for me, I tend to do like, well, what's more progressive? What's clearly showing? What's actually working? Because I think that we only care about what works. And so
ultimately,
like I don't really only care about what works. Like I do value research, but it takes a long time. And research actually is way ahead of practice, you know, but I really care about what works for people, that's safe and doesn't do them harm and helps them understand their own body and bring things into balance better. So it's kind of my MO.
So can I ask a question then? I don't know if it's directly related to food sensitivity, but it's in this ballpark, because I think with autoimmune conditions, you know, a lot of people would say, I've certainly said, that, I mean, my general approach to my health is an anti-inflammatory approach and the full spectrum of anti-inflammatory, you know, from reducing stress to toxic burden to food. So, you know, it removes, you know, taking out typically inflammatory foods and, you know, working out what that is for me. And that has changed over time, definitely has done that. So that may not be a food sensitivity, for example. Well, let's say take gluten. That's probably the most common one. And yes, you can have them. If you take out the non-celiac gluten sensitivity, gluten's typically inflammatory. So, I mean, is that a reason to remove a food even if you're not sensitive to it? Like, do you know what I'm asking here?
Is there harm? Is there a problem? Like, what are the pros, cons? And you can always do like an experiment to see how you do with something, I guess. I don't know. I don't think maybe revise the question or let me know if I'm on the right track, I guess. Is it better to remove the thing because it can be inherently inflammatory? Is that the question?
I think so. Like, even if you take it aside from this, whether you've got an actual sensitivity or intolerance to it, simply because it's inflammatory or typically inflammatory, and maybe it's not inflammatory for every person, but is it worth removing for that reason, even if there's not a food sensitivity to it?
Well, if you're not going to have a negative reaction to it, and if you aren't sensitive to it, then is there a reason to remove it, right? So that's a good question in general. Like, is there actually pros? So what would be the pros to removing it if they're not having any symptoms or whatever? I will say on the stool test that I use, there is a marker for gluten sensitivity actually. So I can kind of tell whether, and I can see what the immune system is throwing for inflammation at that moment. So I actually do guide fairly well around this. But then the question is, because most people want to eat gluten, is, well, how do you do with it? And then you see, and there are certain enzymes that help you process and digest gluten in dairy. They're called peptidase enzymes. So sometimes that'll be really helpful for people when they're trying to like bridge that. And again, it's not so simple as gluten at all. It's and especially if we're talking about thyroid in the United States, all commercially processed baked goods are full of bromide, which is a halogen, which is displacing iodine, which is essential for thyroid T4 to T3 conversion. So you don't know it because it's not on the ingredient list, but it's a dough conditioner. So it's been used for decades. And guess what's on the rise? Thyroid issues for decades, right? Issues, and that's not the only thing, right? It's not one necessarily thing. It's multiple things. But what if it's not just gluten? What if it's the other processing of it? What if it's, there's lots of like questions there for me too. Cause like in general, I think we want to enjoy food. And so it depends on how that person responds to it individually. I think the only one that's really hard with this is like, where are your antibodies with it? And so you can always check your antibodies before, do some gluten and see. But again, you have to do the rest of the treatment plan. It depends on people's values and goals to them. If they're like, I love not having gluten, I'm fine with it, then do whatever you want because it's your body and your life. Like, it's fine, right? But if you want to have gluten sometimes and you really want to know, there's an opportunity for you to explore and experiment with that and kind of test those symptoms and see how you do with things. And can you do it with peptidase? What I was going to say is that gluten varies throughout the world. I'll have people who are in Europe eating whatever they want, and then they'll land in the United States and start having reactions to it. And this is documented again and again from other people. So there is something in our processing. Do I think it's just glyphosate? Absolutely not. If that was the case, then people would react to absolutely everything. So it's deeper than this. Is actually a question I have for a long time, but like glyphosate doesn't add up to all of the answers to me, in my opinion, at all. And I could totally tangent on why. So. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's what it's interesting because I think with thyroid or, autoimmune thyroid, there are a lot of things that we're commonly recommended to remove. And so I suppose look at it and see how it goes, right? You do like an experiment of sets. But it really goes back to, similarly, it goes back to like, well, what if I'm struggling to digest grains in general and carbohydrates in general? And what if my gut is a mess? Then I would really, you can certainly remove it, like to add, again, like if you're trying to get off of a sprained ankle, removing food can be sitting on the couch with a sprained ankle to allow you to heal a little bit. And then you can kind of see where you are. So it just depends on the person. And again, I just think gluten or grains or wheat containing products or whatever are they're on quite a spectrum. They're not all equal, right? So there's like higher quality versions as with everything. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I think a lot of the questions that my community had around food sensitivity and the testing, I think in some way are a bit superfluous given the conversation that we've had around that. But then I guess if people are being sent for tests by their practitioners, then they can talk to them
right.
about
And,
exactly
it doesn't
how to monitor that.
Right. If you have a practitioner, you're working with them doing food sensitivities, right? Experience is your best way to learn something. So, and there's multiple ways to do things. So I do things a certain way because of the things that I've learned over the years with clients, right? And so your practitioner may have a certain process that they like. And so who am I to say that what you're doing, again, like, unfortunately, we learn that something works or didn't work for us, right? And then we move on from there. Because if something works, we're plumb happy about it. And then if it doesn't, we're like, oh, I'm still looking for more answers. So that's okay too. I know no one wants to fail at anything and they want to get everything right the first time. But that's part of why that's part of why we're in this situation in the first place. Because there is no perfection.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah, there's no such thing as health perfection. I've worked out too. It's taken me a long time to come to that conclusion. No. But I suppose, like if you're going through this process and maybe you're doing lots of, elimination diets or trying different protocols, and you're getting exhausted with it.
Right.
Do you just take a break? Like,
absolutely.
What's your
right? What's the point of that?
Right.
Because if you have more stress, you are creating more problems. That creates all the stressors that you have come in, whether it's emotional stress, physical stress from a pain or something else, causes way more problems than any food causes. I can take that to my grave. I see it. I can see it in the research. I can see it in the clients. I can see it in the response. It matters much more. So if I am getting the impression that the restriction of the food is worse than 9.9 times out of 10, we would not choose to do that. We would support the stress chemistry, the adrenals, fill in the gaps. Your stress is creating deficiencies, which breaks everything else. Because if you create mineral deficiencies because of stress, which you do, then the minerals can't feed the enzymes to work properly. And if enzymes don't work, well, then you're just going to be in a self-feeding disaster. So it's real fun because it's like a little bit deeper because we like sound bites and we like things to be like, remove gluten. It's the answer to everything. Well, probably not. Yeah, that's probably not the answer for everyone, for everything.
Yeah, we do. We want it to be simple.
We want it to be so easy.
We do want it to be easy and we want it to be set and forget. We want to just tick box, done that, move on, next thing. That's, that's what we
and ease is a perspective. So what if it is easy? What if you don't have to remove XYZ thing? What if you just have to heal these imbalances and understand them so you don't create them in the future? What if that is easy? So that's that's a nice way to think about it. Because I think we're not serving ourselves. I was on a podcast the other day and she was talking about like, well, it was really hard to get that much protein. I was like, that's a perspective, right? I get it. That's just simply a perspective, right? So it is challenging to figure it out anytime we do anything for the first time. So as we get it figured out, after we've done it a lot of times, you're like, oh, well, I got it. I'm good at this now. I can do it.
And even the, I mean, even if you are sensitive to something and you do remove it, whether that's for a short period or long term, I think that's a perspective. Like I find it easier and this is less stressful for me to say, I just don't eat gluten.
And was it always that way? Did it start that way?
It took time to do.
Right.
It took time, but now it's like, well, I don't have to debate every time.
Did you go through a mourning process during that where you were like, oh, I'm kind of sad about this, right? So,
there's definitely, there's a grieving process for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, like we have such an interesting attachment to our food that just has nothing to do with the food, right? And that's okay. It's fine. We all have that. So we're just at different stages, right? So like once you're good, you're okay with that because you've gotten good at it. Like it's easy for you to make a replacement or make a swap or ask at the restaurant because you have experience. So you're just like, once you're more experienced, it's like easy. Right? It's no big deal. But if someone's just starting, it can be, or if they don't desire it, or depending on their situation. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. I just have like a specific question around immune memory to foods. Like does the immune system have a memory to foods?
Yeah. So there's half-lives of.
Does that play into this as well?
There's a half-life of certain, let me go back into the recesses of my brain and try to quote this properly. The half-life of certain white blood cells can be anywhere from 10 to 14 days, and then some have a much longer one. So when I'm doing food, this is actually a great question because when I am doing food sensitivity work, if I'm not seeing some big changes, like within 10 to 14 days to 3 weeks, maybe I need to move on some things, right? Like, yes, there are some that live longer than that, but by then those things should be out of immune system memory. Most of them should be, and I don't know what the percentage is, I can't remember, but so if you can get things out of immune system memory, so you can't really even make a decision in theory. I mean, some people can for sure, because they have very significant reactions to things, and that's okay. Like, there's going to be people who might come at me and they're like, oh, well, gluten makes me feel like poop and blah, blah, blah. Cool. Like, that is you, right? That's just not like 100% of people. So anyway, yes, if you can get something out of immune system memory and then reassess, I always recommend people do a symptom questionnaire, you can just Google up multiple symptom questionnaire, and you do that before and after, or before and then like 3 or 4 weeks later, and just see where things are. Because what you don't track, you can't, what you don't measure, you can't, like, it's just part of awareness, right? So like sometimes you don't realize all those little things.
Well, and I think a lot of people don't. For example, you mentioned earlier, like all the brain fog, mood.
You just don't even know.
Lots of people don't. I think a lot of people just think gut symptoms, and they're not connecting the gut with the brain and mood. And so for some people, I know they'll never get a gut reaction to a food, but they may get a brain reaction. And so they're not connecting those dots. They don't know what they're looking for.
That's so timely for gluten, because maybe 1/3 of gluten reactions are digestive, and maybe 2/3 can be mental or brain based, right? So you can get anxiety or something like that from gluten versus just a digestive symptom. So that's so tricky, because we want things to be so obvious and so clear, right? Like skin stuff, we're like, can we just put a cream on it and be over? Like, no, what's it really trying to tell you? So, I mean, this is how our life is. It's like, we think it's this issue, but really it's like some other layered issue. And this is like totally unrelated to health, but just other pieces of our life can be just like that also, right? The check engine light is on. If I just turn the light off, everything should be fine. No, you must go find where the problem is. You know, there's so many cool analogies that we can use for our body. Our check engine lights are on a lot, right? And then they're like really flashing. So you have to go do some diagnostics and figure out what the actual issue is. And the good part is that people are smart and they are doing this, but it takes some trial and error. It's not the standard of care is not the best care right now, right? For most conditions, right? It's keeping you, we're very good at keeping us alive, but keeping us optimal is a different story. So
yeah, that's right. And that's, I mean, in part, that's why, you know, we podcast, right?
That's exactly why.
Because it's just helping people, you know, in a much broader way. People don't have access. I would say most people don't have access to good quality ongoing healthcare that can really, as you say, get to the root of the root of the root, you know, and manage symptoms along the way. And we're complex. Autoimmune disease is really complex. And but
then if you've been doing it for a while, you're like, well, this is easy. I might say like, well, it's kind of easy sometimes, you know, if you've had some experience or if you've been learning for a while, those people, it's much easier for them to, like, for example, if I work with someone, I can tell who it's going to be easier for and who it's going to be harder for. If you've had no exposure to something, it's all going to be new. You're going to learn a certain amount, and the people who've had more exposure, they're going to learn deeper information because they're looking for deeper information. They already have some of that baseline. So everyone has to start somewhere.
Layers, isn't it?
Yeah, everyone has to start somewhere.
It's a bit like an onion.
Don't worry if you're on step 1 and someone else is on step 10. Like, life has always been that way. Just start learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Obviously you are, because that's why you're here. The end. So you're already
that's right. So you're
already
listening. You're already here. And don't get confused. I think it's that paring it back, that big picture, like you said before, Christa. It's what's really going on. And I think we can get lost for the trees in the forest.
Oh, totally.
You know, we can.
It's a good analogy.
And even if we've been doing it for a long time, like I have periods of time where I get a bit lost. And I think, oh, hold on a minute, and I'll pull back. Like, what are the big principles here? You know, and I think what you've done is really provide a much broader perspective on, gut health, immune health. It's not as simple as run a food sensitivity test and this is how to get the best value out of that. Do you even really need it? Right. Yeah, I think that's it's quite liberating. What you've shared is
good.
Is liberating for people.
And you'll either learn that the food sensitivity test was useful for you, or you will learn that it's not. And if someone's going to go through the work of having a conversation with me, then I'm able to tell them, right? And sometimes they're very surprised that I'm not recommending. I'm like, well, I would love to save you several $100s, and just like jump to the next step. That seems more useful. So
seems spend the money, spend your money wisely. I was talking about that with another podcast guest recently. Like, how do we get the best value? I've done a few posts about this recently too. How do we get the best value out of our healthcare? Because
take more of an active role.
It's expensive.
Take a much more active role. If you don't and you expect someone else to do all the pieces for you, it'll be much more expensive for you because you won't get, for example, I have my clients log their symptoms and supplements and what they're doing. And I can look at that in a moment. It's more work for the client, and I can look at it in a moment and see what's going on. If they don't include that, I can try to collect it, but it's a huge waste of time. It's a huge waste of their money compared to if they were also being more aware. Because what I find is like at that point, then they're also being like suboptimally aware, right? It's not as aware as they could be. And if they can, I'm not living there, right? Like I don't live with them. And so if they can't help share what's going on, that just like allows us to leapfrog ahead so much faster. If someone's able to come and say, this is what's going on, and here's what I think is going on. Some other examples of this would be if you've got a complex medical history and you've seen several people, and then you present to an appointment with like me or someone, and you don't come with a bit of a history, like nicely itemized and bullet point, you're going to waste all your time retelling your story and forgetting pieces. And I've seen it like multiple times recently. So I always recommend if people can come with like a bullet point list or submit it in advance, we're going to be able to like pull the pieces together much, 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 much faster. So just being your own advocate. And that's what that can look like. Write it down. Yeah. You've been through some stuff. Write it down because you're going to really appreciate the time it saves you from like, guess how exhausting it is for you to tell people? And guess what it tells your brain? It's like continuing to build a neural pathway of like, I am broken and I cannot heal and all these things when you tell them like all the stuff that you've done. Because if I had a quarter for every time someone told me they did everything and I'm like, no, you haven't. So there's always, and I look at that as opportunity, not as negative. I look at it as you have things you can do. Of course you do. Right. But if you can't clearly like tell me what you have done, how can I pick out the pieces that you haven't done so you can quickly. So anyway. Just little. Yeah,
well, no, I think that's really helpful. I talk about that a bit, keeping good records. In fact, last year I wrote like a journal, like a My Thyroid Story journal. So with all of that, so you can put all your history in there, what you're working on, what you're not, what supplements you've taken, so it's all of that.
Yeah, it's cool.
And just to have it in one spot, you can just take it with you to your appointments. Here's my thyroid story. And, add to it over time because, as you say, I think I used to be a lawyer and, lawyers charge in 6-minute increments. And I used to say to my legal clients, don't waste your money on me for things that you can get elsewhere. If you just want to ring up and have a good cry and a whinge, that's fine, but you're going to be paying a lot more for it than if you do that with your friend.
Yeah.
If you're coming in to, write your, court documents, the more you've done, exactly like you said, if you've written that beforehand, I can tidy it up and put it in the right format, but if I don't have to extract all the information for you in my time, so it's exactly the same. We've just got to think time is money. And so what can you do as a patient ahead of time that you can then take into your appointment so you get the best bang for your buck?
And you're going to use it again and again, and you don't remember things, right? So just expecting you to remember all that in that moment is so unfair to you, and it's not going to give you, it's just not going to give you very good ROI.
Yeah. Well, there we go. There was a little tangent at the end. But Christa, I want to thank you for your time today and, going on a few little unexpected little diversions. And I found that really, really helpful. And I'm sure those listening have too. So is something I haven't asked you that you think, the audience needs to know and where do people connect with you? How would you like people to do that? You've covered it all.
I think since we're talking about thyroid, I've been spending a lot of time interviewing thyroid experts lately. And so I think that the simple way to say this is that no one knows what they're doing. That's my consensus. It's like, no, everyone is still looking for how to optimize overall thyroid. And it's because it's almost like I work with eczema a bunch. So I see this all the time. It's like we try to treat it the same but it's like it can be lots of different layers. So one of my favorite layers I'll just mention is like even before people get a diagnosis, right? But they feel like they've got symptoms, but it's not showing up on blood work. So there are options and like other testing and assessments that can show you if things are kind of sluggish, and tools and things you can do to fix that. Namely, looking at minerals, seeing those deficiencies, filling them in, food-based sources, et cetera, which was really transformational. There's just so many cool opportunities. And if you look at it like that, it's like, oh, what are the opportunities for my thyroid to feel safe, imbalanced, or balanced, nourished, et cetera? I would say like, you want to just love on that thing, right? And all of its compadres. And so I think that's the end goal here on all podcasting, hopefully, is like this empowered message. And you have so much opportunity to bring that into balance and to live a more energetic, happier, better life. So that's what I would like to say there. Yeah. You can find me at my podcast, The Less Stressed Life, or all of the things that we're currently doing are on christabiegler.com/links. So that's where I like, just, it's the most updated page, christabiegler.com/links. So anything we've got, I just kind of update that one if we change anything.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'll make sure that is all linked below. So that is awesome. Thank you very much, Christa. Really lovely to meet you. And yeah, I love all these connections with people all around the world. It's really helpful. So thank you for all that you do in the health space as well, and the way that you're contributing to global health and wellness and being less stressed and healthier. And really, really appreciate you.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right, that was a lot of information, wasn't it? So let's keep it super simple. This is your KISS Thyroid coaching segment at the very end, so that you don't just walk away and forget everything that you have heard. So what I want you to do is just stop and take a moment. If you can't do it now because you're driving the car or walking the dog, then do it as soon as you get home, or, just maybe make a little note on your phone. But what really stands out to you as an action step for this episode? For example, do you need to find a practitioner to work with around your gut health, just to see if there's other things going on in your gut, like mold, like dysbiosis, like leaky gut, like other imbalances that Christa was talking about? You need to explore those things so that perhaps you've got a greater food tolerance. Perhaps you haven't written down your thyroid story. And if you haven't, I would love you to use my little thyroid story book. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm showing it in the picture. You can get it via Amazon, or you can do a little print your own via my website, which is letstalkthyroid.com. So yeah, just really helpful little tool I put together last year to help you write your thyroid story, have it with you wherever you go, and just to think it all through actually is quite helpful. And I don't know, maybe another thing you could do is think about, after all of that, do you still want to have some food sensitivity testing done? Do you need to remove a few foods and see how you feel? I know that there's a lot of different approaches, and I mean, in a lot of ways, that was a very liberating conversation. But your actions will depend a bit on where you are in your thyroid journey. Are you freshly diagnosed? Are you still in that diagnosis process? Or are you like me and 25 plus years down the track and just sort of, working with some nuances around the edges? Because that will depend on the actions that you take. So have a think about it, jot a couple of things down, and take action if you need to take action. And have a fabulous fortnight. See you next time. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Thyroid. If you have enjoyed the content, or perhaps you're thinking, oh, my mum needs to hear this, or my sister, or my bestie, I would love it if you would share this episode with them. That really just helps spread the positive and practical message of Let's Talk Thyroid, and helps that broader thyroid community, our friends and family, to live well with their thyroid health. So you can just, share the episode. If you subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to, to this podcast. It's free. It's really helpful because then you'll be notified every time a new podcast comes out, and it just makes it much easier to find. There's usually a little subscribe button or a bell or follow often is the terminology. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, that would be helpful. Of course, if you want to leave a review, even better, just a sentence or two about how the podcast has helped you. You can definitely connect with me via letstalkthyroid.com. That's where you'll find access to my book, my coaching, my freebies, and really everything that I offer in terms of thyroid support.